Let's now look at slave experiences. And it can be quite difficult to generalize about the lives of millions of people over 3 centuries, but one good way to start breaking it down is to compare rural versus urban slavery. So in the countryside, rural slaves worked not only on large plantations, but also on small farms. They worked in the fields, in sugar mills, in mines, on cattle ranches, in personal homes, and they also worked in transportation. And in general, slavery in the countryside was more brutal than in the cities. And this had to do with the fact that they were subjected to a harsher labor regime in the countryside. And there was really often no direct contact between the slave and master in rural areas. So there was no relationship often between the slave and master. In the cities, slaves served as porters, carpenters, musicians, barbers, and butlers. And many female slaves, such as you see pictured here in the image, they worked selling goods in the streets. And they also worked in markets and as vendors in market stalls. And these retail activities in the cities gave urban slaves more flexibility in how to conduct their business. And they could earn money for themselves this way. And this money could then be used to purchase their freedom later down the line from their masters. City slaves sometimes had the option to rent out their labor, and they would turn their earnings over to their master. In urban areas, slaves also came into contact with the free black population, and they might come into contact with slaves involved in the skilled trades. And many of these slaves involved in the skilled trades, they might learn how to read and write. So slaves in the cities often retained their language and their religion also. And information spread more quickly among urban slaves. And in these ways, urban slaves enjoyed more autonomy in their daily lives than their counterparts in the countryside. In both the cities and the countryside, slaves resisted their condition. And the most common form of resistance we think about, of course, is outright rebellion, or perhaps running away. But there were everyday forms of resistance, such as breaking tools, feigning illness, staging slowdowns, and committing acts of arson and sabotage. Also, by practicing one's own culture, that was a form of resistance also. It was a way for slaves to maintain their dignity without overtly challenging the social system. And this might include religious practices, folklore, music, and dances. And practicing these cultural traditions helped slaves to survive the harshness and misery of everyday life. And in this way, they could maintain their identity, one that was separate from the identity of their masters. And so in Cuba, for example, rumba music developed, and they would get in a circle in the streets and they would dance to rumba music, and oftentimes they would mock their masters, and their masters wouldn't be able to tell exactly what was going on. And in Brazil, there was a mixed martial art that developed called capoeira, and in the discussion this week I'll show you a video of how capoeira was practiced. The most common form of resistance to slavery in Latin America was flight, runaway slave communities that developed in the interior of Brazil and also in Cuba. I mentioned these in the previous lecture. So in these palenques and quilombos, slaves could grow their own food, they governed themselves, and they resisted attacks by authorities. And oftentimes these runaway slave communities, they would facilitate the flight of more slaves. They were often located in inaccessible places, such as the mountains or under the canopy of the forest. But sometimes they were even located near plantations. Most of these communities, of course, they were ruthlessly suppressed by the colonial authorities. But in Brazil specifically, a lot of these quilombos, they endured. And in fact, some of the communities in the interior of Brazil, they can trace their origins to being quilombos. Most of the Maroon communities were small, but one famous one that I'll discuss here in a minute was actually quite large and included thousands of inhabitants. And just to give you a number of how many communities there were, in 19th century Cuba, there were about 80 palenques on the island. The most famous of all the runaway communities was the one I've listed here on the outline, and it was Quilombo dos Palmares in the interior of Brazil. And it developed and existed for pretty much most of the 17th century. They're in the 1600s. And this Quilombo, it grew to include between 10 and 20,000 inhabitants. It was the largest in Brazilian history. It had its own churches and its own fortifications. And the Portuguese tried 6 times to conquer Palmares. And they sent 6 expeditions between 1680 and 1686, but they failed. But finally, in 1694, Palmares was defeated by the Portuguese and it was destroyed. And that's kind of the image you see going on here in this scene. The slaves at the Quilombo defending their community against the Portuguese. Slavery met a slow death in Latin America, and it was really over much of the 19th century when slavery would be abolished in the region. So we've already talked about Haiti. That was the first country not only to gain its independence in Latin America, but the first to abolish slavery in 1793. And in Spanish America, most of the countries abolished slavery between the 1820s and the 1850s. Remember, most of Spanish America, they were societies with slaves, where slavery was not as important to the overall political and economic system like it was in Brazil. So when slavery was abolished after independence in Spanish America, there was no large planter class that resisted the abolition of slavery. Cuba, of course, is the exception to that. Cuba remained a colony of Spain into the 19th century. And after the Haitian Revolution, that's when slavery and the sugar economy really took off in Cuba. And the slave population grew dramatically during the 1800s in Cuba. And Cuba's first war of independence, it was called the 10 Years' War, and it was fought between 1868 and 1878. And the rebels, they promised to abolish slavery, but the war ended in a stalemate. Cuba was not able to gain its independence, but the war did undermine slavery. And so in 1888, the Spanish government passed an abolition law. In 1880, the Spanish government passed an abolition law, and it promised to liberate slaves within 8 years. And slaves continued to labor for their masters during this period, and they could still be bought and sold, but after 8 years, they would be set free. And under the law, masters were to pay their slaves a small wage. But really, masters gradually began to free their slaves so that by 1886, slavery had finally met its end in Cuba. Brazil would be the last country to abolish slavery. And the British, beginning in the 1820s, when Brazil gained independence, the British started to put a lot of pressure on Brazil to abolish slavery. But slavery continued to grow in Brazil because of the coffee economy, which I'll talk about in the next video. And the British even began to capture slave ships and to liberate the slaves there at the ports of Brazil. And finally, in 1850s, the last slave ships made their way to Brazil, and the slave trade was abolished. But like in Cuba, it was a gradual process of abolishing slavery in Brazil. In 1871, there was a law that was passed that was called the Law of Free Birth, and it stated that all newborn children of slaves would be set free, and slaveholders of the children's parents were to provide care for the children until the age of 21, or turn them over to the state in return for monetary compensation. And finally, in 1888, the final blow came to slavery in the Americas. And so the abolition of slavery, particularly in Cuba and Brazil, is quite different from the United States. There was no dramatic civil war or emancipation proclamation that freed the slaves. Instead, it was a very gradual and slow process.